Hey guys, it's Courtney. I'm back here with another video for Not Too Shabby. Today I'm going to bring back out the Fairy Good Friends stamp set by MFT, and today we're going to be creating a very simple one-layer scene using our Copic markers, which I know can be a little intimidating. I'm definitely not an expert when it comes to this, and I've had a lot of comments that people struggle with this. So we're going to keep the scene very simple that any of you guys can do with either your Copic markers or any of your alcohol markers. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp out two of the little fairies here with Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink. And I'm stamping on a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. And I'm just going to kind of position those. I have a rough idea of what my scene is going to look like, and I'm going to kind of build my scene around the images. So I like to start off with what is going to be my lightest color just to kind of map out where my ground will begin or end. And I also want to put a tree in here. So mistake number one, drawing the tree first because now I have to draw over this green line. But I am using a very light color, so I shouldn't have a problem. I'm also going to bring out the E50, which is a super light color, and I'm just kind of adding some color in the basic shape of my tree just to kind of map it out. I'm going to go ahead and fill this in later, but this kind of will just give me the placement. So once I have the placement, now we're going to go ahead and add some dimension to this tree. So I'm going to bring out my darkest color, which is the E59, and I'm basically just adding shading on either side of the little tree trunk and kind of where the branches meet. The branches on the top will not be so noticeable in the end, but I do want to add those in just to kind of let those shine through. I'm also adding just a little bit of shading in the center of the bottom portion of that tree trunk. Next, going in with the E57, and I'm just extending these areas out a little bit further. Being the tree trunk is a rounder object, I do want to keep most of the highlight area in the center. Doing the same thing with this E55 and filling in a majority of it. I'm just leaving a little tiny bit of room for my E53, which is actually my highlight color. You want to use your highlight and your darkest color more sparingly than the others for the most part, for most images anyway. So once I had the tree trunk and the branches all colored in here, we're going to move on to the tree portion itself. And this is super easy. If you can make little dots, you can do this. So I'm starting off with my YG03, and I'm just creating dots on the basic shape of the tree. And I'm basically putting these all over. We're going to go back in with this color later, but this is just kind of give me a guide as to how big I want the tree and the shape of it. Next, going in with the G07, and I'm putting more dots towards the center because that will be the darkest area, meaning they'll be a little bit closer together. And as I move out to the edge of the tree, I'm spacing them out a little bit further. Same thing with the G03, going directly over those dots that I had down for the G07, again closer together and kind of spreading out as I move to the edges of the tree. Same with the G02, just spacing them out a little bit towards the end. Finally going back in with the G03, and I'm adding dots everywhere, directly over the darker ones that we had created in the center and going right along the edge of the shape of the tree that we had created in the beginning. Now, if your colors aren't really blending all that much, and my YG03 is going a little dry, so I went in with a YG21, which is a very, very light yellow green, and I basically just went over the entire area. And these will make these little dots kind of blend in a little bit more and look more like leaves, I guess. I did want to add some color to it, so I brought in my R85 and my R83 just to add a few little pink dots, and this will basically look like there's some buds on the tree. So next, once my tree was done, we're going to move on to the ground, and again bringing out that G00, which was that lightest color, and I'm pretty much going to fill in the entire area. And this is mainly just to get the paper saturated. I am going around my images, but at this point I'm not being overly careful just because I know I'm going to have to go back in with this lighter color again anyway. So at first I was going to add, well, I did add some texture within the ground with the G07, G03, and G02, along with the shadow underneath my little fairy. I also added some blades of grass on the base of the tree and realized once I went back over that with that G00, it just wasn't enough. I needed to add a little bit more dimension to the ground itself. So when you're looking at the ground, it appears to be darker the further back it is. So I'm just going to add a little bit of shading with that G03 towards the back, blend that out a little bit further with the G02, and then once again going back in with that G00 just to blend those areas out, and also making sure that I come very close and sometimes over, because I'm not too careful, that image and the tree, making sure that there's no white gaps. So once that was done, we are going to move on to the sky. And first I'm going to add just a few little clouds. And I've done this in previous videos, and it can be a little challenging to create the perfect cloud shape. So here I'm not creating a perfect cloud shape. I'm just basically creating a blob with my C1. I'm going to add a little bit of shading with the C3 just towards the bottom portion of that little blob, and just flick that color up just a teeny tiny bit. If you look at clouds in the sky, most of the time they're not actually completely white. They definitely have some shading to them. Blending that out a little bit further with that C1, and then I'm going to quickly go over my colorless blender just to get rid of those harsh lines from that C1. Next, we're going to fill in the rest of the sky, starting off with that B00, and I'm just going to get my paper saturated a little bit just to make my colors blend a little bit easier. So I'm not going to go very high with this yet. This is just basically going to be where I'm going to add my shading. Going to add just a little bit of shading with my B14, so I'm basically just outlining where the grass or the ground meets the sky, and flicking up my color to make my blending a little bit easier. If you haven't mastered the flick, you don't need to do this part, but for me, it just makes my blending a little bit easier. But if you go over it several times, you shouldn't have a problem, even if you don't flick. Going to flick that color up a little bit further with that B12, and then I'll move back to that B00, get those colors to blend a little bit, and then I'm going to carefully go around my clouds as well as my little fairy, both of my fairies actually, with that B00. Now there's certain areas that you may have to go over twice if you get those streaky lines that alcohol markers will give you. No matter what alcohol marker you use, you're probably going to get those streaky lines when you're filling in a larger area. So it's not the marker, it's just the nature of the marker. So once my sky was completely filled in with that B00, I am going to move on to the coloring of the little fairies themselves. Now I did have some areas that I did go over my fairy with either the green or the blue because I'm just not overly careful. So I also, by the way, did darken up my blades of grass with the G28. So I'm going to use my colorless blender just to get rid of that green and the blue that I've actually gotten on my fairies. And then I will move on to the skin tones. Now, some of the areas, it may not be your coloring. It may just be the colors bleeding a little bit because we added so much ink. But as long as it's faded, at least faded, you won't notice the difference once all of your coloring is done. So moving on to the skin tones for this first fairy here, I'm going to start off with my lightest color to map out the darkest areas. Now her little neck and her arms are super skinny, so I'm not adding a whole lot of shading there, but basically adding the shading mainly on her face, which will be where her hair is hanging over her face, blending that out each time, and then finishing off with that highlight color just towards the bottom. I added a little bit of color to her cheeks with that R20, and then quickly went over with that lightest color just to get that R20 to blend in a little bit. Moving on to her hair, I'm going to use my E50 markers, and I typically like to start off with my darkest color for hair just because I feel like it gives it more texture. I am going to add the darkest areas where her hair is kind of gathered in her little pigtails, as well as where her hair is parted. And I'm varying the lengths of the width, or the flicks, not widths. So some are a little bit longer than others, and this is what's going to give the look that the hair is kind of shiny and has some highlights. Did the same thing with the E57, just extending those flicks out a little bit further. Same with the E55. You can see I'm not going over it too many times because I want to preserve those flicks. I don't want to blend those in. I want to keep those. So I finished off her hair, and then I'm moving on to her little dress here and the little bows in her hair. Going to bring out some V markers, and again, starting off with my lightest color to map out my darkest areas and also to get the paper saturated. Going to add some little triangles, basically, where her little skirt there is gathered up. So it's kind of a wavy line towards the bottom of her skirt. Where it is indented up is where I put my little V's or my little triangles. Now you can see they're really long and skinny with my darkest color. And each time I go over those with the V06, V04, and then back to that V12, I'm making these triangles or V's a little bit longer and a little bit wider each and every time. But for this particular image, I'm keeping quite a bit of space for my highlight color because I want these little folds in her dress to really stand out. For the top portion of her dress, I just added a little bit of shading. It's a very tiny area, but I did want to keep a center light source. And then once again, finishing off with that lightest color, that V12, and I'm just going to blend these areas out. Just put a little bit of shading on her little bows too, just where it's kind of gathered together. And you can see that once everything is done, it does look like folds in her dress. It will look bad before it looks good. So keep going with it if you feel a little discouraged. So next I'm going to move on to this next little fairy here, starting off again with her skin tones. And I'm going to use a darker combination for her skin. But once again, starting off with that lightest color to get the paper saturated and to map out those darkest areas. Once again, the shading is going to be where her hair is hanging over her face. Just adding a teeny tiny bit of that E18 for the darkest color. This is just basically the shadow. Extending those areas out with the E15, then the E13, and then back to the E11 just for that highlight color. For her little teeny tiny ankles, and there's a little teeny tiny, I'm just basically dabbing on the color with the tip of the marker. Not doing any shading here. Did add a little color to her cheeks with the R22, and again going in with that R or E11 just to blend those out a little bit. For her hair, I'm basically going to do the same technique. I'm just going to switch over to the black marker as being the darkest color, but again making sure that my flicks are different sizes or different lengths, and I'm going with the shape of the hair. So you can see that there's some areas that those flick lines are straight and others that are kind of curved. Same thing with that C7, just extending those flicks out a little bit further, making sure not to go over the same area too many times because I want to preserve these flicks. Now you can leave this white space and our hair will look super shiny, or you can go in with a highlight color, which I did the C3, and I very quickly went over it just so I don't have any complete white space. Now for her dress, I'm going to basically do the same thing with some RV20 markers, but here I'm making the wavy line on the bottom of her dress here is not as harsh as the first one. So instead of triangles, I'm kind of curving it a little bit, if that makes any sense. But basically doing this shading the same exact way as I did the first dress. Now I brought out my RV25 as my darkest midtone, and I have no idea what happened. It looks like somebody chewed the nib on my marker. I don't know whether you can see it on camera, but I don't know what's going on here. So before I went in on my card with it, I tested it out on a scrap piece of paper to make sure that it wasn't going to affect it, and it doesn't appear to affect it. So if and when I get new nibs for my markers, I will definitely replace this just in case. So again, just extending those areas out and those little curvy triangles, I'm just making those a little bit longer and a little bit wider each and every time. Again, for the top portion of her dress, the only shadow I really created there is where her one arm is hanging over her, hanging over her body. So finishing off again with that lightest color for the highlight area, and I did go out of the lines here. It didn't bleed. It was me. It went out of the lines. So I'm just going in with that B00, which was the lightest color that I used for the sky, and just going over that area I went over or went out of the lines, and that will kind of act as a colorless blender. Just going to add a little bit of shading with the C3 and C1 to their wings, but leaving quite a bit of white space on the tips of their wings. This is just to add a little bit of shading. And then I am going to go ahead and die cut my whole scene down, and I'm using the diagonal stitched rectangle die, and this is also by MFT. I did have this centered, stuck it down with some post-it note tape so it doesn't shift around, and must not be sticky enough because it shifted. So I realigned that, stuck that back down with the post-it note tape, and then ran that through my Gemini. Next, I realized that that one little area that I went out of the lines with those pink colors was still showing through. So I just went back in with that B00. Keep in mind, you may have to do this a few times depending on the color, and pinks and reds and purples sometimes can be a little tough. So next I'm going to go ahead and stamp out my sentiment. And again, this sentiment is obviously part of the same stamp set. Going to pop that onto my acrylic block using black dye ink, and I didn't really leave a whole lot of room for my sentiment, so I'm going to try to squeeze this in right on the center on the very top of my little scene here. Here's where I realized I forgot to color some of the areas. So first I added a little bit of shimmer to their wings with a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen and went in solid with the Y26, which is kind of like a golden color. Didn't really do any shading here for this top fairy's little wand there. Also added a little bit of color with a RV66 to the little belt or band on her dress there. And then I'm going to go ahead and adhere this down to my card base. And I'm using a top folding A2 size note card, and I'm gluing this down flat. I use the Tombow Mono Multi Glue, leaving just a small white border on all four sides. Now, to add just a little bit of texture to their wings, I'm going to bring out some glossy accents and just very carefully go over their wings. Now, this will appear to be a little cloudy in the beginning, but once it dries, it will be completely clear and that shimmer will shine through. So that is it. That is the card for today, guys. I will leave all of the supplies listed below. Don't forget about your Not Too Shabby discount code, and have a great day. Bye.